to a common interview between the Bulgarian National Radio and Cross Border Talks, in which we have a special guest, Yanina Korniienko from Slidstvo. This is a leading investigative site in Ukraine. And I hope and I think it will be an interesting discussion because there is an underreported, in my view, story in Ukraine. Usually, media reports about Ukraine are dealing with war or with geopolitics, but we somehow remain less aware of the successes or the advancement of civic society in Ukraine. And investigative media in Ukraine have great influence and have traditions. And we are now going to discuss about Slidstvo, which is one of the leading investigative media, and understand how this media contributes to positive social change in the country. So, Yanina, first of all, can we start with an introductory question? Could you tell us some words about yourself, your position, your professional experience in Slidstvo or beyond it, and also just in short to present your media?
Hello, thank you for invitation. It's really nice of you uh, to um, to put in public a situation in Ukraine and invite Ukrainian journalists for this discussion. So I'm working for Slidstvo Info Media. It's investigative media. Was founded in 2012 by Anna Babinets and Dmitro Gnapets, Ukrainian journalists. And mm, before the full-scale invasion, Slidstvo Info worked as investigative media working more on corruption stories or crime stories. And after full scale invasion, we had to change our focus and now started to work as investigating, like we started to investigate war crimes and as well, of course, we are continuing working on investigation high scale corruption. I'm working as investigative reporter here, and before that, I worked in OSCRP research team, and years before, I worked in Ukrainian Truth. So all my career, I worked as investigative reporter mostly.
Okay, Slidstvo is known for having very good investigations on anti-corruption. I am aware of cases of investigations in the judicial system, for example, and also importantly, Slidstvo dared to make investigation about even the president of Ukraine, the acting president. So, could you tell us more about the investigative activity and successes of your media and the public reaction, not only, of course, not only in terms of the institutions as well, but also Ukrainian society, to what extent there is resonance when you have a good investigation?
Yes, so I also I have to add that Slidstvo is OSCRP partner. OSCRP is Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting project. It's network of global network of investigative media all over the world, and Slidstvo is a member center in Ukraine of OSCRP for like decade, and we participated in a lot of loud stories and projects like Panama Papers, Paradise Papers, Swiss Secrets, etc., etc. Like everything that was on public, and that's basically how we found a lot of interesting data about Ukrainian politicians and made those loud stories about presidents. So we made a story not about president who is now President Zelensky. We also made a story about Poroshenko, a previous Ukrainian president, and about Yanukovych, a president before Poroshenko. So that's actually yeah. So it's really hard. It's really hard to blame us in a specific like special law to specific politicians. We made investigations about all presidents, and that was leaks from different offshore countries. So my colleagues they analyzed documents and found offshores companies, presidents of shores companies. That was loud scandals, and that was worse to reveal because I believe that that's what journalists have to do, is to finding uh, finding corruption and put it on light, so then voters and like just civil society in Ukraine can make their decision based on facts, on elections or on the daily life, making daily life decisions, right? So yeah, so that was stories about presidents of shores, but we also making a lot of uh, a lot of other stories about politicians' corruptions, for example, in judicial system, as you mentioned. We made a few documentaries about that, and one of the story was about constitutional court in Ukraine, and we made a presentation on the wall of this court. So basically, my colleagues screened it on the wall. We brought projectors on the street and showed it on the street, and exactly like like put it projector in front of the wall and showed it. uh, and since it was public place, it was allowed to do for us, and I believe that made a huge impact because it brought attention for first of all to the story, and also to a court, to a corruption in the court system, which was like pretty high previous years. I wouldn't say like that's only Slidstvo's responsibility, but also civil society and active society uh, involvements in that. But judicial system become better in the years. It's not the best still, and we're still actually fighting in a court with some people right now, and we see that the process is not really clear, but some of the judges was re-elected, and they passed examination for like checking their transparency and their knowledge and stuff like that. We also made stories um, about law enforcement authorities in Ukraine. So that was investigations about security service, about police, about yeah, even about every authorities actually. That was mostly about corruption, also about their not really useful and not really transparent departments. Also about their connections with government. Yes, and any other violations that we might see in this perspective. Yeah, so that was like a lot of different stuff before the war, and now we hope we will keep doing the same, but it become more like it's harder to do now because of war. We have more problems in this area. I mean, in the investigating area, because a lot of registers are closed, and we weren't able to search for declarations of politicians for last 2 years, but now it's going to be changed, exactly because of the pressure from media and from civil society. We also, yeah, so there are like a set of registers which are closed in, let's say, so-called safety reasons, right? But in the reality, it's something that's really useful for politicians, and sometimes it's really hard to explain by safety reasons, more like by their own interests, right? Yes, so I hope we will get back to anti-corruption investigations more this year, and that's like kind of our focus. But we still need to do some urgent stuff in terms of war reporting, and I believe this really, it's really close to civil society needs.
Okay, you mentioned that war changes the focus of your activity, and I know that you have also been dealing with the procurement for the army, but maybe you also have other issues to investigate in relations to the war. Um, and importantly, the Minister of Defense of Ukraine was set to resign because of exactly such problems, maybe some kind of improper things related to procurement for the army. So, could you tell us more about your activity now in the conditions of war and war related activity in your reports and investigations?
Yes. The story you're talking about that was published not by Slidstvo but by our other partners in Ukraine. They made amazing investigation about corruption in the Minister of Defense in Ukraine, and yes, that raised a lot of discussions in Ukraine, and we also start looking closer to everything military does in Ukraine, to the tenders and to all this stuff. But I would say it's also quite hard because it's uh, it's kind of closed a sphere. We can't get all the information we want, so we can just search a public procurement and public information which is available online. uh, it's still enough to watchdog what's going on there. um, but yeah, but it requires specific knowledge for that, right? So now we are trying to focus more on like sanctions, violation of sanctions. For example, transfers of European components to Russia, and how it's actually uh, it's really related to Ukrainian situation now. So that's what we want to discover deeper. But at the same time, of course, the procurement of Ukrainian authorities connected to military is highly important, because I believe that we have to fight enemy. By we, I mean the Ukrainian citizens and civil society. We have to fight the enemy not only outside of the country, I mean, like on the war field, right? But also inside the country. Like during the war, we need strong institutions which don't have corruption, and if we have it, our duty is to fight it and to be sure that all the money we got from our partners goes to the purposes we really need, not like standing in someone's pockets. So yes, sure, journalists doing a lot of work right now in this way, and yeah, and we're also writing news and daily stuff about that.
How dangerous is to be an investigative journalist in Ukraine today, bearing in mind that historically there have been some cases when journalists even lose their life or face a lot of hardship? Uh, there has been always this speech of some mafia influence, etc.
Yes, yes. Actually, Slidstvo was like started their documentary career, let's say, right? Publishing documentary stories exactly from this kind of case. It was murder of Pavel Sheremet, a journalist who was killed in the center of the Kiev by because his car was exploded in the center of the Kiev. So my colleagues and our editor and founder Anna Babinets and her colleagues, they started to investigate it deeper, and they found actually the guy who was on the place of like near the car that was exploded a night before, and they found people involved in that, right? So that was even before the official investigation found at least any evidences. So that's how it started for Slidstvo. We followed all loud cases of murdering journalists and activists in Ukraine and made few more documentaries after that. And last one, it was about journalists during the war, exactly. So that actually documentary I worked on. It includes a few stories of journalists in Ukraine who was kidnapped or killed by Russians. So I interviewed more than 20 of them, and they shared their experience. And the main point is journalists in Ukraine are not just random victims. Uh, they are aims of Russian soldiers, and they are like second one who are their targets when they enter the city. The first one are militaries, right? So yes, so these people who was and also this is like wrong idea that the biggest danger for journalists is to buy on the front line because of the shellings, but it's pretty high possibility for journalists in Ukraine to be tortured in the basements in occupied city, and this is something we have to talk about because um, these cases are not widely reported on the foreign medias just because Ukrainian journalists are afraid to talk about that because Russian soldiers who kidnapped them and lately let them go, if they was lucky, right? So they still have access to their parents or relatives, and journalists are not able to, share this experience with everyone because they're afraid of their relatives. But I managed to find few people who was able to talk. It's three journalists from Kherson region and Zaporizhia. So one of the men he was tortured and kidnapped by Russian soldiers in Kherson region. His name Oleg Baturin, and they actually played him. They asked him to go out of the street because they out of the building. They used his friend, who is famous activist, and they kidnapped this activist first and forced him to call to the Oleg and forced him to go out of the house for a meeting. That's how Oleg went to a meeting, and he was also kidnapped and put in captivity. So they tortured him and forced him to sign an agreement of collaboration. Lately, they let him go, but not everyone in Ukraine was. I I don't want to use the word lucky, right? But whose uh, um, whose life changed after that in a worse way. For example, another journalist in Kiev suburb. He was kidnapped by Russians and put in a Russian prison, and he's still staying there. Also, one more journalist who was killed in Russian suburb by Russian soldiers, and he was actually perpetrated because that was our colleagues in Reporters Without Borders organization discovered is that he was he was murdered because they found a bullet in the ground like 20 centimeters down, which means he was shot it from the top, and means that Russian soldiers who did that clearly saw a press word on his vest. So yeah, so we've collected these kind of stories, and we wanted to show that yes, the journalists in Ukraine are aims, and Russians also using lists of journalists to found them and target them. So it's not just like random journalists they found on the street. It's a list of journalists prepared a month before the full-scale invasion. Some of the list was prepared by local collaborators who know the citizens really well, and they wrote it down all the names and just helped Russians to catch those journalists. So journalists on occupation like in a huge danger. Journalists in Ukraine, I mean, who is investigating war crimes, but on the Ukrainian territory, which is under control of Ukraine, uh, they are quite safe. However, we also getting some like we got recently some threats from, I don't know, like cyber Russian forces or stuff like that. They said we should collaborate, or otherwise we will be on the captivity. But a lot of Ukrainian journalists and war correspondents got those emails, and didn't pay that much attention for that. But it doesn't mean this danger is like impossible or so far away. It's possible scenario if once we will appear under occupation or Russian forces will be too close to us. So yeah, this is really danger. If we talk about investigating Ukrainian authorities or Ukrainian government, it doesn't feel like a danger. It never been actually so much. Well, it depends on cases, of course. It's been danger for some of the journalists who investigated Ukrainian-Russian connections, right? So it's not really clear who was the biggest danger part for that. But still, yes. Uh, I would say what I experience now, for example, it's a court fighting and not really fair enough. And I would say yes, like investigating this kind of stuff, you might appear in a this kind of fights. But as for now, we never mentioned any physical threats from Ukrainian part. Of course, it was only by Russians.
Okay, thank you. Apparently, Ukrainian journalists pay a price for being professionals and responsible for what they do. Um, there is also difficulty to be an independent media, I guess, in a country which is in war and which is also historically having important oligarchy. So how is Slidstvo being independent financially, and to what extent the civil society of Ukraine supports Slidstvo? What are the ties of Slidstvo to partnering media of its type in Europe? Um, Perhaps you could introduce us a little bit to your business model of success.
Well, uh, I'm not the best person to talk about business model of media because I'm not really involved in that issues. But as far as I know, so Slidstvo was supported by multiple organizations, like donor organization who like donate for our existence. And we also have we ask our readers and the people who watch us to give us donations. So it's not that much, but it still covers some expenses. We definitely collaborate with all our partners abroad. For example, also CRP partners are our main partners, and also CRP supports us a lot. And yes, so I think this is possible just when you're doing your job and people trust you, and you can show a quality investigations. And other partners in Europe who like follow the same values and the same ideas, right, about making the world more transparent and like bring the justice. So they want to collaborate with us, and usually they reach like approach us, and or we approach them, and we're doing this kind of collaborations. For example, this documentary about journalists was made by support of Reporters Without Borders, for example.
Okay. Um, Finally, I mentioned in my introduction, um, there is, in my view, an overviewed change or transformation in Ukraine in the last years, which is related to the growth of civic culture, democratic culture, um, and to what extent your media contributes to that, to what extent you feel this change really advances thanks to journalists in Ukraine. Is really Ukraine moving to um, better compliance and integration of, let's call them, Western or democratic values?
Um, well, I think that the main basic rule of democratic society is no tolerance for corruption and the transparent dialogue, right? And that's something that we also follow. So I think in this way we are definitely contributing that and um, revealing any kind of crimes in Ukraine. We believe that that will help, that will, like, we like pass ball to the human rights activists, anti-corruption activists, etc., who will doing their part of job. I mean, like, we're revealing stuff and they have to, like, follow it later, bringing it to the courts and finding it in a different way. uh, that how it works, but also is raising attention of the public, publicity, right? From the people in Ukraine, right? So they paying attention on that stuff. As I said, as I mentioned before, they making right decisions. Also, they can, Ukrainian politicians, after few revolutions in Ukraine, kind of afraid of, or I don't know how it's going to be right now, but years before, it was like feeling that they don't really like um, people's anger, right? And publishing investigations, we are kind of rising this public anger on them, on the cases of corruption, let's say, or violation of law, or abuse of power, or stuff like that. And yes, I think this is how we push this transformation from the society who is on the way, like, to our way to democratic society, mostly to the Western society, let's say. So yes, so I believe journalism work is a primary role in that. So it's just uh, basic stuff, and the other players in Ukrainian society has to also be active to make it everything possible to make it work.